Hi, we are here to have a conversation with Babeth Mondini-VanLoo, and the topic is actually women and film and filmmaking. Babeth, welcome to this, as I said, open conversation. I would like to start mentioning the beautiful book that was published a couple of years ago, which is about your life and your art. And the title says it all: art equals life equals art. And I would like you, as a first question, to expand on this notion of the connectivity between art and life, which is so defining for your work and for your life and philosophy, if you can talk about that.
Yeah. Well, I think, when I studied art in Germany, that was late 60s, it was very important that there was a teacher to be found that was not separating art and life. And of course that was because, we were hippies, we were young, and freedom was really what we were all about. And also to make art that really talks about freedom. And so I found Joseph Beuys, and I went to study with Beuys, and for him, that whole notion of the expanded notion of art, where art does not concern itself mainly with retinal activities, but at the service of the mind, and maybe in his case even further. But for me, it really made a stamp on the rest of my life, because I started from that point on always wanting to make art that was what he labeled as social sculpture. Mm-hmm. And in that, there is no distinction between art and life. And so, the book and my work is actually shows how that influences each other, how art influences life, and how art is the creative force by which we can transform our lives.
Yeah. And indeed, very beautiful, and that's very prominent in the book. You explain also about that, and I was wondering the role of the medium of film, because you use a lot of mediums in your career, in your life, and but I was wondering about the role of filmmaking. Let's say, if you can maybe say something about what is so special about the medium of film, and how that connects to this expanded notion of art.
When I was studying with Beuys, and also before that, I was making touch sculptures and installations. And I was starting to use little short Super 8 films to document that, because I also believed in the immediacy of the work, and it could be destroyed afterwards. And I did a lot of live performances that had no documentation. So this notion of impermanence, that art doesn't need to be something that you hang on the wall, was always very apparent. But when I started to make these little movies to complement that, I got so fascinated by the fact that also in my personal life, music was so defining as a creative force. So I wanted to work with a medium that had both image and sound. And because film is such a prominent medium to do that. And also, of course, in the beginning I did everything myself, and that's why I also went to study filmmaking in the US, because there in New York I could study film from all aspects. Like here, for example, in Holland you have to immediately choose if you want to be a director or camera or this or that. And in the United States that was not necessary. So I started to study film as art, because it was incorporating all these things of immediacy in front of a camera. It was basically first performative art that I was using in films, and it was the question of music and how image and music can work and make a total work of art.
And was it for you a difference between using, for example, Super 8 or 60mm? Or
yeah. It was, and that was because, maybe because also only when I started to work with 16mm, I started to do real editing. beforehand I was just letting the camera roll and I was just documenting the performances. So it had to do with the fact that only once I started to begin in 16mm, which was from 74 on, that I also did professional editing, I would say, and I was learning how to do that. So it made a big difference.
Yeah, and then if we talk again back about the concept of expanded art, is how important is for you collaboration? How do you see collaboration? And then I'm interested in if for you it makes a difference if you collaborate with women or men, because you also mentioned in the book that you work a lot with energy, that you see yourself as a mediator, and I can imagine, I feel it myself, collaborating with men brings a certain energy, collaborating with women brings another sort of energy, and how does it translate it for you?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because I remember very distinctly that I was filming Beuys at the Venice Biennale, and that somebody wanted to send, they was very strict who was allowed to be there, because Andy Warhol was standing there and there were very few people that were... And he said to the man who wanted to send me out of the room, I was the only person standing there with a camera inside his own space. And I was working without a tripod, with the Bolex in my hand and just me. And he said, no, that's not necessary, because she belongs to me and the work, and she can make herself invisible if that is necessary. And, you know, he had that beautiful laughter, and he made jokes like, she's Marlene Riefenstahl, or, you know, things like that. Mm-hmm. And so it immediately broke the whole tension in the room. But it is true that I think that I also noticed that later on when I started to make Buddhist cinema with people like Dalai Lama and other people that are too many people always crowding them, that you can make yourself invisible, and working with that kind of energy of being either totally right there and you can work with your presence, that was very different. And if that is different with women, I don't think so, but I think that, at least not for me, working with women, it's not different, but I think that women are more capable of doing that, and that they have an inclination of being more aware of what is... This is, of course, not in general, said in general, but in my experience, I could notice that women are more aware of interferences and kind of harmonizing them. And so that has all to do with working with energy.
Like being, like I could almost add, like maybe women have a sort of antennas of feeling what the energy around them is, so that they can adapt, maybe. At least I'm also talking only from my point of view and my personal experience, and I feel I'm always aware of a certain energy, if people, certain mood maybe, and energy, and then it has an impact on me, let's say.
Yeah. It's not necessarily adapting, it can also be conducting. You can also conduct that energy. You know, you don't necessarily have to adapt what is going on around it, but you can notice it, and it has all to do with awareness, and you can transform it, and you can conduct it, direct it, and
yeah, that's interesting. That goes then more into the role of director, which is what you also, of course, are. So that fits more into your way of being part of making something happen. Which is what you want, in a way. You let something happen, but you make something happen.
Yeah.
I think that's the balance that you try to achieve. One question that I'm interested in, and I wonder if it fits your life as well, is that I can imagine that women entering the field of art have to make some sort of sacrifices in the balancing between making art and their own personal life. And I wonder if is something that, if this making sacrifice is something you recognize yourself in, or it was just different from you?
Well, it definitely came into play when I became a mother, when I had children. Then I had to sacrifice. But before that, I think, you know, I mean, it's a whole different ballgame to grow up as a woman than it is as a man. And of course, you know, I was a lot in male company, and also around artists that were usually, it was dominated by males in that time. And yeah, and you encounter things like, I remember making, you know, editing a part about Beuys here on television in the Netherlands, and I was pretty young. And the man who had to edit was much older than me, and he had quite a problem with accepting, you know, having to follow my orders because I was the director. And I could see that he just wasn't used to it. And so I don't know if that is a sacrifice, but it is an interference. So I think it again comes back to how to deal with that in order to not make it stand in the way. And it's not possible to always do that, because it is, of course, damaging to a situation you want to just be able to work. And I have an interesting answer to that, because I once did an interview with Jean-Luc Godard, and he said to me, well, you know, I work usually with women, and especially when I search for new collaborators. And I asked why, and he said, because they are more honest. They always tell me all the things they don't know when they come to ask for the job. And the men are sort of the opposite. They always pretend that they can do everything. When I ask them, can you do that, can you do that? They kind of, you know, tend to say that they know how to do all the things. And the women are usually more in doubt, and they usually say, maybe I cannot do that, or maybe not that. And he said, so because it's a kind of a more honest way to start a relationship and of working together, it was easier for me to do that. And I found that interesting.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah,
I found that interesting.
I recognize that also. And I wonder, because I mean, the female identity, it's also part of your work, and often you put also yourself in the picture in your film. So it's about you as a woman, about you as a woman artist. Can you maybe mention something? Indeed, you already mentioned one part of collaborating with women from Godard's point of view. What would be, in your eyes, the essence of a woman identity when talking about arts, and maybe in this case making film? Is there something that you can pinpoint, that you can say, this is really the power or the essence of that really strong, I feel, with the woman identity that then can translate itself in a piece of work?
Because in my early performances I worked with identity, and it wasn't necessarily that it was only about female identity. It was about what identity is. And this was late 60s again, and it was about the exchange, like the performances that I did with another female artist. The two of us worked together a lot. And I would mainly dress up as a man. And why I found that interesting, especially if you go on the street or in art spaces or something, that people treat you completely different as a man. And it was interesting to become a man in that moment. It was interesting to play with the heroism of maybe wanting to be a man, you know, because I think many women, including myself, suffered from penis night, one of those periods in your life. And so to dress up as a man and to also play with that fluid, flexible identity was very interesting, not only to me, but also to the people who would react to it. Because if they think it's theater, for example, then they would think, or ask, is this theater? And when you say, this is art, or I'm just a character, or I'm this and that, then if it wasn't theater, then they couldn't kind of put it in a label or in a box. And so I think the identity had more to do with working with conditioning of our lives, of all our identities, with male or female, and with the fact that personally I believe we are all have both identities in ourselves. We are male and female. And I was learning to adapt maybe more the male at that time, and also trying to shed off the restrictive identity of being a woman. So it was a healing process, basically. So I think identity is really, really important, but it goes beyond gender. And it has a lot to do with, so working with myself as a person in the art pieces was maybe a fact that I could control it more, but also that I could go really deeper, since for me, transformation was really important, and transforming in a healing way. You know, I believe that art could heal, be a healing tool in society and in our feelings, and I could do that better if I could access it myself and make myself as an example of a female in an environment that's either male or both.
Yeah, and that I think it's continued all your, right? It's still continuing your work. It started back then, but it's the ongoing process.
Yes.
Yeah. Now I would like to ask you something about role models or inspirers or people that have left a mark that were important for you, and how that worked. How do you see the figure of a role model of the inspirer? Can you name some, and in which way they were important for you, and how do you translate your art, that inspirational power, energy, into your art?
Yeah. Well, I already mentioned Beuys, and that is, and you know, changed my whole life, changed my whole way of being, but also the whole way that how I looked at art. So I don't want to actually talk more about him, but that was my main inspiration, I would say. And but since we are talking about cinema and women, I think, you know, I want to name a few women who were mostly important to me in cinema. And the first one I want to mention is Ulrike Oettinger from Berlin. You know, I met her in the mid-70s, and I already dedicated my film about the Sex Pistols at the Berlin Wall to her. That was 1977. And it was an interesting figure to me because I was living in the US. I had moved from New York to California. And I was traveling a lot with films made by female makers. And I was traveling the US, but also to many European countries. And for me, Ulrike Oettinger was the sort of the counterpoint, very much more European, but also they were fictional. I was traveling with documentaries. And my main, you know, inspiration in documentary is Maya Deren, who was not alive anymore at that point. But Ulrike was actually a person who was making fiction. And what was important in the inspiration that I felt from her was, on a personal but also a professional level, that she was doing her own camera, which was the extension of her being as a director. She was an excellent photographer, by the way. And her films were actually commenting a lot about cinema. They were either parodies on cinema, but it was also very much about the female identity, you know, like a film like Madame X, which was based on women pirates. And, you know, nobody actually had ever heard of those women who had actually existed in the world. So she was using archetypes of the female landscape, making them very big and making them very authentic. And so the use of female protagonists in their strengths, but also the joy and the humor that came with it, and her total control of doing the design, you know, the everything that the scene in which everything took place. And she was also trained as an artist. I think that was also important for me, you know, that all the women that I would name today are trained as artists also. So she was an artist who also became a filmmaker. And so the way that she produced everything herself, so it was a question of really putting the finger on it wasn't, I don't know, some called it feminist cinema, but because it was so much playing on the role of cinema in and of itself, and it was challenging those conventions of cinema with total humor also, and with showing strong female characters, that was quite new at the time, and still is. And so she made so many films afterwards that it's not really feasible to name them all. But it was interesting that her documentaries that she started to make were also really filled with the visual aspects, and that were really conceived also with the same kind of perfection that she would make the fiction films. And and those were a lot of times inspired by world ethnographical things. And they, you have a film like Tiger that lasts for 8 hours, or she would document Chinese, also women, but also in Mongolia. And lots of times there were female characters in those films, but also male, but also the extinction of cultural disappearance in those parts of the world. So to me, she is magnificent and a big influence.
And is this fact that, let's say, that she was doing mostly everything by herself that kind of spoke to you at the time when you met her?
Yeah, the fact that she
opened up possibilities.
That her camera work was the extension of her own body. That she was not controlling has a negative content, but it was the fact that she was determining everything herself, and having it in her, doing everything, including most of the editing afterwards. So yeah, that was very inspiring. But also the way that she would portray women really spoke to me. And then the second woman I want to mention is Meredith Monk. And Meredith Monk is in New York, lives in New York. She's been at it since the 60s. She's an incredible, she's called the coolest composer of the United States. Besides that, has like programmed for a whole year Carnegie Hall, or makes small installations and huge operas. And there's dance, film, all those aspects. And that is what also spoke to me. And it's also the fact that she is still doing that. And I would say, when we are talking about ourselves, which are women of riper age, and we are, maybe using the wisdom aspects that come with that riper age, but also the experience that you gather for so many times. And, without getting in the detour, I saw the same thing with Joan Jonas, the performance artist. But coming back to film making, I would say, that Meredith was amazing. Also, when she started then to make films, she, in the beginning it was a lot about like a film like Ellis Island, which talks about immigrants coming to the US. And if you look at them now, and it's incredibly beautiful poetic imagery of immigrants coming to the US, and you could actually see the restrictions that were laid upon them and the way that they are being treated. You see them now in the migrants coming here to Europe now. It's actually amazing, that history repeats itself so much like that. But that was another example how somebody talks about is in a way, it's not activism, but it's done in such a poetic language and in such mastery. And same for her film Quarry and Book of Days, and and it had also addressing the Jewish issues in those times. But anyway, so she was another big inspiration because she was also doing a lot of performances. And so our friendship and collaboration was crowned by the fact that I made a long documentary about her, 82 minutes, called Inner Voice. And in that film I followed actually the creation process of a new theater piece she was doing, a big piece with many female characters and a couple of male musicians also participating. but she has this core of females that work with her all the time. So it was following that whole creative process of how a new piece of music theater starts to exist. And then, you know, when it is ended, and then it became an album, and I wanted to depict that. But of course, I also went into archival material of what she did in the 60s and films like 16mm earrings and things like that. Yeah, so this became also very important, and we both share the conviction that our spiritual life is very important in the making of our art. And she's also a Buddhist like myself. And so we also shared that. So we were artist friends and Dharma sisters, as she calls it.
Yes, yeah, I read that actually in the book. A very beautiful introduction from her, explanation about your friendship and the way that indeed this not so much compassion, but this feeling that you both share for caring about the creation and about the people and about the process. That is something that's
she's much better than me at getting it seen, you know. So I was very thankful that the film premiered at the Guggenheim Museum, and with a wonderful curator, Alexandra Monroe, also a woman. So, you know, I think I can learn a lot from that, but I'm always already on the next project before. Yeah, that's one of my weaknesses.
But is there something about, because you mentioned briefly the fact of ripeness, let's say the age. Can you maybe say something about, I mean, we can touch upon it or move on, but I can imagine that the more you get older in the field of the arts, the more it gets difficult maybe to remain visible. The concept of visibility is something that I'm confronted with in my work as an archivist, and in principle we try to go back and look at the past, so the older the better for us. But I can imagine from the maker's point of view, it's really becomes more difficult. Maybe Holland even more than America, I would think, or even other countries where there is this, in a way, almost obsession about the youth, this addiction to youth, in a way, I would call it. And so I wonder how you see that.
Well, I see it very strongly happening, and not only the addiction to use, but also the commodity of art marketing, of cinema marketing, or the commodity of even content. I remember, you know, when traveling with those early films, like people would get upset when I would show Maya Deren as a feminist in a feminist context, because they would say, well, that's not feminism. Feminism has to talk about the hardship of women, and she doesn't do that. And so those were interesting topics, because the sensibility of her can never be done by a man in the cinema like she did it. And I would say that is still the same way, that older women these days, I'm totally inspired and so happy that women like Joan Jonas get shown so much, while they still make the same work that nobody looked at in the 70s. And so it's wonderful, you know, that they're being rediscovered, or that they're still going on, they keep on going on. And so I'm myself, of course, also, you know, I don't like the word victim, but it's true that you become a part of that. You don't count anymore if you're over a certain age. You don't even, you know, forget about getting money anywhere. You know, making applications to make work is so difficult, or you become, you know, one of the 2% or something. And which is too bad, because I feel we have so much mentorship. You know, we as older women and as older artists, we have so much to give. I have been teaching at art institutes in the Netherlands and Berlin and London and America for over 25 years. And it was wonderful. I feel that is really part of my art, is that communication with the young people and learning from students, you know, and students learning from you. And so the enclosure to making those work fields visible to them, giving them access to a whole other way of thinking, you know, like we were thinking in the 60s or 70s. You know, if you grow up now, I mean, you know, if you have to reinvent all that, it's impossible. But so to share that is such an important thing. And so I hope that there would be a little bit more. I also am joyful. I'm working myself on a new documentary that really addresses those issues. And so joyful that you see old actresses on Vogue covers, or, you know, the old actress in herself is getting another status.
You touch upon a very important part, because the one about mentoring, and something that I want to discuss, because a lot of time when we dig into the history of women and filmmaking, let's say, if they are often written off some history because maybe exactly because they've been more into teaching or other things instead of making art. So this whole idea that art needs to have a product, and while, as you say, mentoring, teaching, being an inspiration, a role model, can be so influential and so important for the newer generation. This encounter between generations is fundamental to develop art, and you have had so many years of experience. But the interesting thing is, often you at least I heard more about the figure of the mentor and the master. I associated that more normally to a man, while actually there's a whole world to discover, and that needs to come up again, about how many women artists were also having the role of mentors in the art academies, and like you, of course, but also Monique Dubos, for example. So, and that Monique Dubos herself has inspired other women that have become the generation of the 90s making videos. For example, Ida Lohman is one that we're working on at the moment, and even Janica Dreisma, for example. So it's interesting, this inspiring and then passing the torch, but that's really a chapter that is not yet well written, and it's missing information. It's hard to find information about this whole network of things that how people were connected to each other. I don't know if you want to say something, because I would like to then highlight a little bit also the role of Monique Dubos, and the fact that you made a documentary on her. And then maybe if you can explain something about, how do you see her? Was she also, in a way, a role model for you? And is that the reason why you made the documentary, or maybe there are other reasons for that?
Yeah. I don't think she was necessarily a role model for me, but she was a role model for many people, I feel, that I wanted to highlight. I wanted to share her creativity, because she was so great and she was so unique. And we met as actresses together in Frans Wartjes' film. And so when he chose me to be his, to give me his job, when he stopped being the head of the film department in Den Haag, he asked me to take on his role. And in the beginning it was difficult, because people wanted me to make, to show that I was making films like Frans, and I wasn't. But at the same time, being in those films, also with the great aspect of Trix, Zwart is his wife, because when I remember that Trix and Monique and me, we would bond around the making of, being there, and around the making of that. And so I think, Monique was unique, and I was inspired by her, because when I, later on, after I had met her years before, I saw her suddenly back. We were in Sim Galleries in New York, and she was doing performances, and I was doing, installations and performance in same places. And so that was also a way in reconnecting with her. But as I said before, I find the uniqueness of her, her voice, her own voice, her performances, and then also the ways that she worked them in installations were, again, also with lots of humor, but also a lot of new technological inventions. And, I would consider her, like myself, an activist of some sort. And I also remember very fondly that we used to meet when I was the head of the Buddhist television station and she was the head of Das Arts. We would meet many times, to have wine afterwards in the evenings because we would talk about how to survive in the system. And as women, as head of organization as females. And she was always, I don't want to do it anymore. She was really like angry, I would say, more the angry type. And I was always saying, it's important you stay in, you have to be within the system to change it. Otherwise, all those boring people will take your job. The students deserve that you be their teacher. What better teacher could they have? And all the people she inspired at the Rietveld Academy and stuff like that. So it was interesting that, she would keep calling me to meet because she needed to talk about something terrible that had happened. And it usually had to do with bureaucracy. Yeah. But that's the fact, you cannot survive in an environment like the omroep, like the television stations, and if you're the head of a station, even if it's a small one, and you cannot survive being the head of an institution that is dependent on receiving grants and money from the government, if you don't have a certain, you have to play, it's not a game, but you have to participate in parts of that system, and it's very difficult, because it usually kills our creativity. Yeah. And so, the main thing is to stay alive and keep being creative within those
And I can imagine the input from, in her case, Monique, were the students, I guess, and in your case was the fact that you were having impact through your TV channel to the audience, that was what kept you going, basically.
It kept us going, Yeah. Because it's one thing to show your installation to 10 people who come by, or to have every week at least 100,000 people see your work. So it's, I fought very hard like a lion for that station, because it would enter the homes of people without knowing it, without choosing it. I mean, it's something else if you already know, like on social media, you go for the same thing all the time, you connect to what you already know. So I believe in niche also, but I believe in the ones that you get inspired by just seeing something. And, if I would show a film about Philip Glass, and people would be amazed, why is that on a Buddhist television station? Because he's a fucking great musician who's been for 30 years a Buddhist. And the Buddhism has influenced his music. So it's not programs about the religious aspect. It's the culture that defines his work, like it did with Laurie Anderson and Lou Reed. All of these people who are Buddhists. And it helps them in their life, and it influences their work. But that doesn't necessarily have to be labeled as such, but you can feel it, I believe, So that's important. Yeah. And with Monique, she was, she was a force of nature, and, such a great artist.
Yeah, I met her once.
And I'm so happy that she saw the film alive, that we presented it together.
Okay.
When she was still alive, because of course I was following her through that whole thing of having cancer and dying. So
and there is one scene that struck me. I mean, there are a couple of scenes in that film that struck me, actually several, but one has to do with the fact that she, towards the end of the film, she mentioned that she would like to be remembered as a strange person, instead of an artist, because she says my video work, it's ephemeral. It will be forgotten, it will be deleted. In 10 years, nobody will watch it. And that really struck a chord with me because, as you know, I'm an archivist, and my job is to try to save the ephemeral art and to collect it, to preserve it, to try to make it available. And so and you ask even that question to Monique in the film, and for me, in a way, your film is I mean, maybe you can talk about that. It looks almost like creating a little archive of her, like an homage, of course, but in there are pieces of her work. And how do you see this relation? What's your take between the impulse to archive, which I have, let's say, we in a film museum, and the impulse to create, which in a way, when you create something, you delete something else or you move on, let's say. We want to go back and to keep. How do you see that?
Well, you know, thankfully, to say a little bit about Monique in that sense, it was an homage and it was something that I wanted to archive what she did, but mainly, I understood very well when she said, I want to be remembered as a strange woman, a weird woman, she said, really. And that aspect is true because she lives on in the hearts and minds of people because that's how she touched them. She touched them by surprise. You know, I think that she will be more remembered for the TV shows and the roles in films and everything than with her own video pieces. I believe that too in the end. But that doesn't mean that those video pieces are not important because they're all steps in her own process. So for me, the archival part in that film is very important because it's part of her life process. So I think that is very important. And I just keep hoping that the role of the archivist is done by somebody else, that we as makers don't have to do that part also.
It's played by us, yes.
So so it's great, you know, and that is collaboration, and that is, you know, some people are good at this and others are good at that, and you know, I'm not an investigative journalist, and I'm not a journalist at all, even though I made so many documentaries. So it's important that other people do that part of archiving, but it is a very important part of the artist's work. And I remember when I moved to America to go to film, I destroyed everything I had made before from the academy. And with Beuys that was possible because it was all about the process and everything. But of course, you know, many years later on, now I sometimes wish I hadn't destroyed my paintings or things that I made. But, you know, sometimes it's necessary, or, you know, later on I left 2 films of mine in the San Francisco that were destroyed. So sometimes that happens, but no, the role of archivists, hail on.
Yes, it's more like we are going now, the closing question in a way. It's because I consider the role of archivists as an attempt to contribute to the visibility. Let's say we were talking about art which sometimes is neglected, which sometimes is art made by women, is often neglected, is often overlooked, is often not written properly about. It's changing, luckily, things are changing over the last 10 years, or 20 even. But the role of the archivist is to try to contribute a little bit to the visibility. What would be, in your, just the last comment on what do you think is necessary to work towards this making visibility of women's work of arts even greater? What would be your tip?
I think that it is important that just like there was a whole, and it's still sometimes going on, that there is this focus on what I call the dictatorship of the great artist. So I would hope that it's not the dictature of the great artist that makes women that are forgotten in history to reappear. It should be about what their contribution has been, and if they were famous or not at the time doesn't really matter. And so that's one thing that I find very important. And the other thing is that it also should be intergenerational, and it should be also, you know, like it doesn't matter if they sometimes made something about male or, the content is free. As I said, I think sometimes a woman makes work differently about, it can be about men or women or children, it doesn't matter. But the way that it is made, the female sensibility that speaks through the images is what is the most important. So, yeah, I'm all for, reworking and saving women's energy, for that matter, that went into making their art on all levels. And especially also art, there's great artists who on purpose did not want to make 10 photographs or documents about their work when they were done to be happening in real life. So the process is very important too, and it's maybe then nice, if I think of Yoko Ono, it's so great, look at the sky is one of her works I will never forget. To stand still on a street corner and look at the sky. I still do it sometimes, and I think of her. So this is how that kind of work also should survive.
So it takes different forms and several forms.
Yeah.
Well, on this note, then I'm going to thank you for this amazing open conversation. Very informative and very inspiring indeed. Thank you, Babeth.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody participating.